Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to be talking about the presentation layer. There's a lot to talk about, so let's go ahead and get started. So as we've discussed, the presentation layer is typically implemented using a portlet component, but it can be built using other technologies. In our example, we're going to be implementing a Liferay module called Gradebook-Web, and we're going to be following the MVC design pattern in order to do so. These are going to be the 6 steps that we're going to be going through. There's of course more than just 6 steps. Each one has a lot of sub-steps, but this is the overview or the high level. So we'll create the Gradebook-Web module. From there, we'll then implement the main view. We'll implement the editing view of our assignment. Next, we'll implement some validation and feedback. We'll implement localization, so we have support for other languages. And finally, we'll add some CSS and JavaScript resources. So let's talk about implementing portlet actions. We've talked about this a little bit already, talking about MVC commands. We're going to go ahead and rehash or review some of those concepts and maybe go in a little bit more detail about them. So when we were talking about portlets and portlet components, we discussed how portlets have a life cycle, and that life cycle has specific phases. In order to implement those phases in the Liferay world, we have these things called MVC commands. Right? MVC commands work alongside of Liferay's implementation of portlets using the portlet class MVC portlet. So in Liferay, we create portlets using OSGI, using that component annotation. And within that annotation, we have a couple of properties that we can define or that are already defined if we're using the template from Blade CLI or Liferay Developer Studio. Again, MVC Portlet is designed to reduce boilerplate code, removing a lot of the tedious code that goes into creating a portlet. That way we can focus on what matters most. So we talked about MVC Render Commands. MVC Render Commands are used to handle the render phase. Right? From the JSP side, there is a name-value pair. The name is always going to be the same MVC command name, but the value is what we as developers are able to customize and ultimately what these MVC render commands are looking for. So in this example here, we have a render URL. We have the parameter MVC render command name. That name is always going to be consistent, always going to be the same. The value, again, is what we as developers are able to customize and decide on. Liferay best practice says that the value should look something like a file path. So like what we see here, my portlet view entry. MVC Action Commands handle the action phase of the portlet lifecycle. They work very similarly to what we saw in the render command. So the action phase in our example is typically invoked when we're doing something to our database object or our model entity. So whenever we're doing something like editing an assignment, deleting an assignment, adding an assignment, this is when the action phase is going to occur. Here in this example, we see the action URL. We have name equals followed by that syntax that we talk about. So rather than the name value pair, as we saw in the render command, the MVC action command just has the name. So that's what we're going to be looking for on the Java side. So MVC Resource Commands, we're not going to see an example of it, but just recapping what we discussed, the resource command is what's used to handle the resource serving phase. The resource serving phase is a way to dynamically serve resources or get content dynamically into an application or portlet. That way, in using the resource serving phase, we circumvent the render phase, we avoid a full refresh. So very handy when we don't want everything to refresh on the page. Some examples are listed here on the slide. Again, typically this is going to be done using Ajax. Here is a simple example of what this would look like on the JSP side. Now let's take a look at how this works full picture. So on the JSP side, we'll have something like a portlet URL, render, action, or so on. Once that's invoked on the JSP side, it will then call a specific MVC command depending on what type of portlet URL it is, whether render or action. So within these MVC Action Command components, we have a property that's set saying I'm listening for a specific portlet. From that portlet, I'm listening for a specific parameter, and I'm listening for a specific type of request, either action, render, or serve resource. So once those three requirements are met, that MVC command is invoked, and then whatever method needs to be called will be called. Whatever processes are programmed within that method will then be invoked. So with MVC commands taken care of, let's go ahead and talk about tag libraries. So tag libraries in the JSP world allows us to leverage some different pre-configured code to make our development in JSPs much easier. So tag libraries typically come in a collection of tags belonging to a specific namespace. A couple of those namespaces are C, Portlet, Liferay UI, and Alloy UI, AUI for short. The two that we're going to be working with the most is going to be Portlet and Liferay UI. We'll have some examples of Alloy UI along the way. So one example here, in Liferay convention, we typically specify all of our tag libraries, all of our dependencies for our JSPs within an init.jsp file. We can then leverage that init.jsp in our other JSPs, referencing that init.jsp. From there, we can then use the specific tag library in our JSPs like we see here in this example. Right, once all of that is taken care of, it'll then render itself into specific HTML like we see here. So there's a number of tag libraries or TLDs that come out of the box. If you check in your file path under web apps root, webinf TLD, you'll have a list of these tag libraries that you see here. So these are just a few of them that come out of the box. You can look for the rest over in that file path. Let's talk a little bit more about tag libraries. So we won't go into so much depth on every single individual tag library. We'll go ahead and highlight some of the commonly used one and what they're exactly used for. So we have the JSTL tag libraries. These give us some basic functionality when we're within our JSPs. We have the Portlet related tag libraries, either Portlet 2.0 or 3.0, depending on which Java standard we'll be using. But again, Portlet is going to be very, very common for us to use, especially when we're dealing with the Portlet lifecycle. The JSTL libraries are going to be found under the C namespace. So again, this is general purpose. It gives us some of the typical features and functionalities that we would expect, things like loops, variables, and so on. Here is one example of the C or the JSTL tag library. So we have the C choose, which is essentially like an if-else statement. We can use that within our JSPs using that JSTL tag library. All right, the Portlet library, we again will declare this within our init.jsp, and then from there we'll be able to use our Portlet tag to do things like be able to invoke specific action phases using a Portlet URL. So there's much more to talk about with tag libraries, but this wraps it up for this video, and I will see you in the next video.